Recently, I found myself saying goodbye for now to Twitter and turning to Mastodon as a place to possibly post some short form content. But in the process of that, I came across the idea of POSSE, which is publishing content on your own site first and then syndicating it elsewhere. I love this idea because it gives you kind of more complete ownership of your own data, and all of these other sites that your data might go to can be there as like a secondary place for that to live. Now, the idea of publishing and syndication might sound a little bit complex, but I promise you it's not too hard. Let's walk backwards through this. The idea is, in the end, you want to post something to Mastodon. Let's take a look at something here. Here's a post I made yesterday about a GitHub access token thing. I'm using a service called Micro.blog to syndicate from an RSS feed, as you can see here, to Mastodon. Really, that's the core idea here. There are lots of tools out there that will let you take an RSS feed from somewhere else and syndicate that to Mastodon. So anything that shows up on the RSS feed will be posted to Mastodon. I'm using Micro.blog because that's a pretty cool community that I'm just starting to explore, and Micro.blog will post the content from this feed both to Micro.blog and then also syndicate it to Mastodon. So for example, here is my Micro.blog page, and you can see the exact same content right here in Micro.blog. Now, if we go to the account settings for Micro.blog and edit the sources here, you can see right here I have a notes.json RSS feed, and then I'm choosing to send that to Mastodon, and you can set up that integration. All right, so now we have something posted to Mastodon via Microblog, but we're getting it from this RSS feed. So the question then becomes, well, how do you create that RSS feed of your notes or your micro posts? Well, of course, any blogging system is going to have a way for you to create RSS feeds. You'll probably even be able to create a custom feed for either a type of post or a tag, something like that. I'm doing it with Eleventy, which is a JavaScript static site generator. However, the thing about a static site is that the content all lives in a GitHub repo. And here you can see is my GitHub repo for my website, shaky.sh. In this notes folder here, we have a bunch of individual markdown files. If we go ahead and take a look at one, you can see this is the original content for that post that we just saw on Micro.blog and also on Mastodon. So the problem that I ran into here was often when you want to make a small post like this, you don't want to be in a place where you have to be able to commit to a GitHub repository. And so I wrote this tiny little service. It's a single endpoint that I called Pidge. And this is what I want to show you today. Pidge is a very simple thing. It's a single API endpoint hosted on Vercel. And the idea here is that you can use the GitHub API to write directly to your GitHub repository. Octokit REST is the name of the GitHub package. And when we get a post request to our handler here, we're pulling a couple of things out of the body. So we expect a Pidge token, a GitHub token, and a note. Obviously, the GitHub token is what we use to authenticate with GitHub. I guess I could have added it as an environment variable in Vercel, but I wanted to make sure that if someone else got access to this endpoint, they wouldn't be able to use my GitHub token. So the GitHub token is part of the payload. Now, the Pidge token kind of serves the same purpose. The idea here is that this is just a password, essentially, that I've set in my environment variables in the project in Vercel. And what this means is if you don't match the Pidge token, then we're never even going to try to authenticate with GitHub. So this way, unless the Pidge token is right, we're never even hitting GitHub. I want to make sure we don't accidentally get rate limited, get my endpoint blocked, or anything like that. We have a simple invariant check here. The Pidge token environment variable must be set. We must have one in the request, and those must be the same. And then the body has to include a GitHub token, and of course, it has to include a note with some text. Now we can figure out a name for that file, format the content. Maybe you want to be able to add some tags. Once we're actually ready to make the post, we can create our Octokit instance, which just authenticates to GitHub with a token, and then we can commit the note here. If you're not familiar with the internals of a Git repo, this is a fun little way to learn about that. First, we're using getRef to get a reference to the main branch in my repo, and then we can use that reference to get the latest commit on that particular branch. So now we know what's the latest commit that we have to commit on top of. Okay, the next thing to do is to create a blob, and this is the actual file content here. As you can see, we've got the content there, we've got the encoding, we're creating it in the same repo. And then once we have that blob, we need to create a tree for this blob. Now, my understanding of the Git internals here is very, very high level, but essentially my understanding is a blob is the actual file, whereas a tree represents the path to that file. And so we can create a tree, and then after you've created that tree, you can create a commit around that tree. So you've got a commit that points to the new tree that you've just created. You need to give it a parent, which is the previous commit to this one. So we've got our previous commit, which is our current kind of head of main. We're creating a new commit off of that and pointing it to the new tree that we've just created. And then, of course, the last thing to do is update that reference. So you've got the main, which we now want to point to our commit.sha instead of the previous commit. So with this in place and deployed to Vercel, I now have a public API where I can easily post content to my site first and have that syndicated elsewhere. Now you might say, well, what good is that if you don't have a UI for actually creating the post? You still probably have to be on a terminal or something. Let's go back to our Pidge repository here. Let's open Drafts Action. Drafts is a handy little app that I use on both macOS and iOS for text capture. And one of the core ideas of Drafts is that you can write your text and then you can run these different actions on that content. Before we actually run our publish command here though, let's take a quick look at the script. Drafts has a JavaScript API internally, and so we can create credentials for our Pidge service, and we can store GitHub and Pidge tokens. When you run credentials.authorize here, if this is not already in the Drafts credentials database, it will prompt you to add those the first time, and then those actually sync between iOS and macOS, so that's pretty nice. So then we can grab those tokens. We've got our Pidge endpoint here. I'm caring about some particular tags. I want to make sure that we do have the micro tag. I don't want to accidentally publish a draft that I didn't mean to publish. We also have a publish tag that is added afterwards, so we can make sure that if it is published, we're going to fail this command and say that it's already published. So then we can just create our object here. We've got the URL, we've got the method, Pidge token, GitHub token, and the note, as we saw on the Vercel side. After that, we can just go ahead and create our request, and if it fails, we can fail it. Otherwise, we send the note name back, and I just tag it with that name. So you can very easily do this in Drafts by creating a new action here, and this is a little bit weird. You can edit it, and it pops up this window you can edit. I did it in my editor and then copied it into that. Once we do this, if I edit this script here, you can see we have the same script that we just looked at in here, and then you can also choose fun stuff like after success, go ahead and archive this and assign the tag published to it. We have this little message here working on a video about how I'm syndicating this content from my own site to Micro.blog and Mastodon. I'm going to go ahead and run that action. And in a second, we're going to see a little pop-up here that says publish via Pidge successful. Let's go ahead and see though whether that content was properly syndicated. If I go back to my static site and I pull, you can see we just created this new file, and you can see there is the content. If we go over to my website and go to the notes feed, you can see here it is right here working on a video. If we head over to Micro.blog, we can see, here we go, the exact same post working on a video. And finally, if we go to Mastodon and refresh the page on my account, what we should see here is also a video working on a video. There we go. Now, is that a little convoluted? Maybe it is. However, that's my example of how I'm doing publishing on my own site and then syndicating elsewhere. If you're doing something similar, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.